Okay, thank you for coming. This is the third in the School of Humanities lecture series. And we have till 1 o'clock and Dr. Gareth Beale, a new colleague from archaeology. Gareth is going to be talking about within the walls of York Gaol.
Thank you, thanks for having me. I'm going to have to, got a lot to talk about, so I'm going to be rushing through things a little bit, but by all means stop me if you've got any questions at any point. Don't worry about that. If you've got any questions about any of the terminology I'm using, because it's always difficult with these interdisciplinary events, talking about things in computer science and things in archaeology and all sorts of stuff. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, stick your hand up if you've got any comments. I'm going to be sort of going through a bit of background. So I'm going to be talking about this project within the Walls of York Gaol, which is a project we've been working on for about 6 months now with York Museums Trust down in York. And it's based on a whole sort of range of previous work. So I'm going to be talking about the whole spectrum of work, but to summarise very briefly, it's all about the use of immersive media. So I'm going to talk a bit about what that means in a minute, but all the way through from sort of augmented reality using mobile phones and tablets through to virtual reality and fully immersive experiences, and how we can use those in a museum setting in a meaningful way. And so all of the work we've been doing is really experimental, and it's all about how we can move beyond the initial thrill and excitement of these kinds of technologies and actually look at move towards a sort of productive space where we're actually using these things effectively in a museum setting. So that's what I'll be talking about today. So a little bit about myself, because there are lots of people here I don't know. I work in archaeology, as you can see here. My background is as an archaeologist of the modern period, but also in digital media and computer graphics and game design and things like that. So that's my my practice as an archaeologist. I'm not someone who spends very much time going out and digging holes in the ground. I spend a lot more time doing the sort of thing you're going to be seeing today. So that's who I am. So if you ever want to talk about those things, feel free to get in touch. So here's what I'm going to cover today then. So I'll have a quick introduction to the project, which I've sort of done already really, but I'll just go over that again briefly. And then we'll talk about immersive media and storytelling and what that means in heritage and archaeological setting, and where we see the research opportunities in that space. I'll then go on to talk specifically about immersive media in museums, and then talk about our installations, and then I'll come up with some conclusions. And this is actually the first time that I've attempted to reach any real conclusions with this project, because it's just wrapping up now, and we've got our launch event on Friday. So sorry if I look a bit frazzled, that explains it. But yeah, starting to reach some conclusions in the project now overall. So that's what we'll do. So who has used some form of immersive media or known that they've used some form of immersive media? Most people. That's good. Yeah, okay, fantastic. So we won't start at the absolute basics then, but this is how immersive media are often conceptualized, as you've probably seen from the sort of fully immersive really of us in this room now, touching things, smelling things, seeing things without any digital intervention, all the way through to virtual reality, which is a sort of technological mediation of the real world, which to a certain extent excludes the rest of your senses and creates a sort of artificial impression of immersion. And our project really arose out of slight discomfort with this idea and of arranging technologies along a continuum of, a technological continuum, and we were far more interested in the idea of mediation, the production of media, and what that means in a museum's context. It's very hard to talk about those things in the abstract. It's all very well talking about technology, but I don't think any of us yet has a very good understanding of what kinds of media we can actually produce for these technologies. There have been lots of experiments in this space, but we've had very few examples in the grand scheme of things, of successful immersive media when you compare it to other media forms like cinema or novels. We've had very few examples of immersive media upon which to build our understanding of what these technologies are for and how they can be used. And really talking about the technology itself, it's of interest, of course, but it's not necessarily the be-all and end-all of work in this space. So we're looking to complicate that a little bit. And the way in which we did this, I should say this is a very interdisciplinary project. So we've got archaeologists, so myself and Nicole, who also works on the project, who's here today. We've also got people working at the interactive media group of the Department of Theatre, Film and Television at the University of York. We've also got museums, exhibition design specialists, and museum curation specialists working on the project. We've got sound designers, we've got games artists, we've got all sorts of different people. So it really is a mix. And the reason I say that is because the idea really of how to conceptualize immersive media and to think about how they can be used productively in museums really came out of a lot of conversations between those people, where we started to think about things a little bit like this. So to really talk meaningfully about immersive media, we decided it was about talking about convergence, as it is with most media. Media generally don't work in isolation. Creative people don't work in isolation. They reference other media forms. You swap tropes and ideas, and novels exist in the same media space in some ways, for example, as television. If we look at Scandi-noir television and novels, they work in dialogue with each other. And similarly, immersive media will work in the same way, and does. So the development of immersive media has been in large part driven by the games industry up till now, and the games industry have a whole range of ways of storytelling, of getting people to interact and feel different ways, and those have been borrowed by immersive media a lot. The specific convergence that we want to look at, though, is the convergence between immersive media and museums. So as I summarised on the slide then, but haven't mentioned yet, the interesting thing about convergence is that every time you get a convergence, there are a whole different range of what you can call affordances, a whole different range of possibilities which present themselves, and they can be the physical medium. So if you're reading a novel, you can read it on the subway, you can read it on the bus, you can read it in bed, you can read it wherever you want to, and that's an affordance of the media. There are also narrative affordances, so the story in a novel is more or less linear by virtue of the way that that's reproduced. And when you get these convergences, these things all sort of seem to, we believe, reform in slightly different ways. And so when you get a convergence between immersive media and museums, interesting things start to happen. If you designed some immersive media for use in your lounge, on your desktop PC, and you have to have sensors put on the wall, and you have a fully immersive mask, the chances are that isn't going to work terribly well if you just stick that thing straight into a museum. The technology won't be robust enough. The story might be designed to unfold over 2 hours. Maybe people don't want to spend 2 hours in a museum. Maybe they do, but these are all things to think about. So different kinds of storytelling, different technologies, different approaches to designing the entire media experience work well in different contexts, and that's the point that we really want to make. So we've taken the slightly bold and not altogether accurate step of defining museums as a medium here, or the exhibition as a medium, but that's just because this is a venue within which you consume media, and so we think it's interesting to think about it in that way. But museums, of course, are institutions, and one of the things that makes them suitable, our hypothesis was, for the development and use of immersive media, is that they are full of designers, educators, and immersive storytellers already. So one of the things that tends to get overlooked when we talk about museums is the fact that specialist curators and exhibition designers are real masters of the art of immersive storytelling, albeit not always in digital formats, but they've got a very strong sense of how people engage with space, a very strong sense of how people move in spaces, how they interact with each other. And these are all design principles which can be mapped onto the design of immersive media and quite effectively. The other thing that is true of local museums is that they are very often central points for local creative economies already. So when I say creative economies, I mean in the broadest sense, not necessarily in the financial sense of people making things and being creative at a local level. Museums will often put exhibitions of local artists. You'll often have designers who work locally designing for museums, and this is already happening. And so we were really interested in how this kind of dynamic can be developed further so that museums can be centres of the production of immersive media locally. So I'm spending a lot of time talking about this, so I'm going to skip that and get on to the interesting stuff. So very briefly then, I'll go through this. So these are the research questions that have underpinned the entire project, and I'm not going to read these out. I'll leave you to read them, because there's nothing more boring than someone standing and reading their own slide. But this gives you a sense of sort of the kinds of things we've been looking at, and these are the underpinning research questions for the entire project. So it's all about, effectively, to summarise, how immersive experiences can create better museum experiences, what the intersection between those two things might look like, and then how the museum itself can cultivate the development of new immersive experiences which wouldn't be able to exist in any other setting. So totally unique media, which we believe they can. So this all began with Viking VR. So this exhibition, the black part on the right-hand side of the slide for you, was an exhibition that the British Museum and York Museums Trust put on last year. And for it, we were commissioned to produce a piece of interactive media which helped to tell the story of Torksey, which is an archaeological site in Lincolnshire, where the camp of the Great Viking Army had been. Now it's just a field, but it was the second largest, I think, settlement in Britain at the time it was occupied by this huge army for one winter. And they said, how can you communicate the scale, and how can you tie objects elsewhere in the exhibition into this sense of scale, this sense of place, can create a sense of place, and link that to objects in the collection. And that was the challenge they offered us, and it had to last for 6 months. So we went for something quite robust and getting a sense of the hinting at making things here. But what we ended up producing was this. So it's an immersive experience in the most tangible, physical sense. You walked into a Viking tent. Embedded in the wall was a soundscape of Viking life. We got people speaking Norse and Anglo-Saxon to walk past and speak to you, and there was rain hammering on the canvas. And you could just hear life in a Viking camp going on around you. And then when you walked up to these barrels, which were also in there, you had these headsets. And you can see this is a virtual reality headset. So this is basically a Google Cardboard headset. And you'd pick it up, and when you looked into it, you'd be able to look around you and see something happening in the Viking camp. So it was interactive, but it was interactive in the space. These aren't terribly interactive. They show you an animated panorama, and I'll go through what those were now. But the space was designed to work as a whole. So it didn't begin with the digital experience. It began by walking into this room, and that set the scene, if you like. So it was about setting the stage for what would then be this experience, or this set of experiences. And these were 4 vignettes, one of which was a boatyard, one of which was a metalworking studio in a tent. We had people trading. This was a great one because there were people having an argument, trying to communicate when they didn't speak the same language. So someone speaking Anglo-Saxon and someone speaking Norse, and trying to have a conversation. And the idea here was to make the viewer feel slightly uncomfortable, as you do when you're in a market in a foreign country and you've got no idea what's going on, but you really want to buy a carpet. You know, that kind of feeling that we're all familiar with, but which obviously would have existed at this time as well. And then games night as well, my favourite one. We found millions of these gaming pieces all over Torksey, lost in the mud. and it was quite clear that not only were they playing a lot of games, they were losing a lot of game pieces, which is a bit odd, but they were very keen gamers, and so we also wanted to create this sense of relaxation, which you don't necessarily associate with Viking incursions into Britain. So it was successful. So what we learned from this, one of the most important findings was that immersive media can be very social. So this wasn't multi-user VR, people couldn't see each other, it was much simpler than that. The social came out of the fact that I'd have a go at this and I'd pass it to a friend and say, look, you can see a dog, or I've just seen someone making a bracelet, and it would be much more social in the real space. So you're really, as I said at the beginning, building on the museum as a medium, because museums are social spaces. So why, we suggested, design the socialness into this little box when it's already a social experience? Can you not just do lightweight interventions which enable people to be social with technology? And that was our goal there, and it worked really well. So VR can be designed successfully into exhibitions. If you have a look at this afterwards, you can see that this case is basically destroyed. It's been dropped on the floor. It's been literally hit against wooden barrels with metal, steel rings around them. It's almost indestructible, but it worked, and the social dynamic worked, and it didn't cause people to stand for 15 minutes just sort of doing this when everything was going on around them. It was very much part of the museum's experience, part of the hustle and bustle of a group visit to a museum. And it was really accessible. Lots of people didn't know it was virtual reality because it doesn't look like virtual reality necessarily. It just looks like a wooden box that's got sort of well, it's little screens in it. And huge numbers of people through this experienced virtual reality for the first time, which was great. So we think about 70% of users. 70% of users we got feedback from. And we also found there was a massive upswing in visitors because of this, because it generated quite a lot of publicity at the time, and we think this is cause and effect. And it seemed, to be a major motivator for visiting. The most important thing, though, was that people seemed very enthusiastic about the fact that the museum could be a venue for innovative forms of immersive media. So rather than designing something which is a gimmick or just something that goes in the corner of an exhibition, we started to get the sense from the museum staff, but also from visitors to the exhibition, that people were really excited about the museum as a venue for new forms of media, much as you would expect them to be excited about that in a cinema or, once upon a time, an arcade, and these kinds of things. You'd go there to experience something that you couldn't experience anywhere else. And people really liked this idea, and obviously it had the economic benefit for the museum that lots more people were coming. So it's worked all around and started to really demonstrate the impact that these technologies can have, positive impact they can have on people's experiences, but also on the business model of the museum, potentially. Data begins to suggest. So then we move on. So that was our first experiment last year. And then earlier this year, we started work on a new project, which was much more closely linked into the strategic goals of the museum. So this was, in a sense, all about proving that this technology had a place in the museum and proving to the trust, York Museum's trust, that this technology was worth pursuing further, and they decided it was, which we were very glad about, which was possibly the greatest outcome of the Viking VR project. And so then we became involved in their big capital investment project, which is to redevelop the Castle Museum, it's called, which is the Social History Museum of York, but it's also part of the former prison. And it was a debtor's prison, the part of the prison that we're working in. And they said that what they really liked about the Viking VR experience was the idea that it took something that could never be in a museum and brought it into the museum. An experience that you couldn't produce in any other way. So it wasn't something that would really have been just as good if you'd done it as a film. It wasn't something that could easily be represented on a panel. It was something completely new. And they said, can you do something similar with the prison cells? Because they're very hard spaces to interpret. They're inherently gloomy, obviously, because no one really, there's a certain thrill to going in a prison cell, but no one really enjoys the experience per se. And also, it's very easy to think about them as miserable spaces, and for that to get quite sort of overblown and dramatic, you know, this was a horrible space, but it wasn't somewhere where people were sort of routinely tortured or anything like that. So how do you tell that story in a nuanced way? And perhaps how do you get away from the institutional history of this space and start to think about it from a more personal perspective? Because obviously a lot of people who were in debtors' prison in the 17th and 18th, or 18th and 19th century, weren't people that we would really consider to be criminals today. They did things which many of us have done and not even really thought about, but then they'd ended up being in a prison, and then ultimately some of them transported or executed. So a really interesting historical space, still within York, but quite under-curated in some ways. This is what the space looked like then. So this is the museum now, and anyone who's been to York will recognise Clifford's Tower there, the medieval part of the castle. And all of this stuff up here has been demolished now. And it's a huge part of central York, and now most of it's a car park, which is very ugly. But it's a huge part of central York. It's a huge part of the history of York for several hundred years, but it's a very hard part to appreciate now. So just to give you a little bit of perspective there, in case you haven't seen that before. So these are the things that we wanted to continue to explore, or to explore for the first time, were continuing the idea of social experience. So how can you experience these places socially? Particularly important when you're exploring a network like maze of prison cells. It's not an easy space to understand in some ways. It's definitely something you want to talk about, something you want to explore together, rather than, it's not simple space. We wanted to introduce the idea of play, and the reason why we chose to explore play here, which we hadn't really done before in the last project, was that play, in the context of a prison, it's a powerful juxtaposition. We were interested in how the ideas of play and playfulness could be used sensitively within this kind of space. So not trivializing the experiences of people who'd been in these spaces, but introducing dynamics which encouraged different forms of interaction with the space. So when we say play, we mean digital experiences which encourage you to behave in certain ways, or it rewards certain forms of behavior. And we really wanted to look at that, because play in places which are perhaps you call them, difficult heritage spaces, people sometimes say, or we talked earlier on the recording about dark heritage, these kinds of not altogether positive heritage experiences, is a complex idea. We wanted to continue to talk about real, annoying quotations there, media experiences rather than bits of exhibitions. So we want to say, okay, can a network of 18th century prison cells become a venue within which you consume new media in new ways, a genuinely sort of new media experience? Do you go to a prison to experience some immersive media in the same way that you would go to the cinema to watch a film, or, as I said before, once upon a time go to an arcade to play a new game? Is that a thing people will be willing to do? Is it a thing people will be interested in doing? And finally, the thing that we were very interested in from a research point of view, perhaps more from the historical archaeological point of view, was untold stories in this space. So it's very easy to think about this space as a space of torment and as a oppressive institution, and giving the institution itself a lot of the agency in this story. So a prison is a very powerful space. It constrains you as a person, and so it's really tempting to sort of react to that and think that's the story we need to tell, reacting to the building. But actually within that building there are lots of other stories, more ephemeral stories of people who were imprisoned in the space, often people who were quite normal, but who have left very little trace, or whose traces are, as I say, quite ephemeral and quite difficult to read. So we're interested in that, and whether we could use the prison as a space within which to tell really some of these, because this was the poorer part of the prison, rich people went elsewhere, stories of working people, which don't often get told, especially in a city like York, which has a tourism industry based on largely wealth, affluence, and celebration of royalty and things like that. So we were interested in whether this could be a space within which to understand some of those stories, particularly given this is a social history museum. So the things that we came up with, well, we came up with 2 ideas, which we've now almost completed, putting the finishing touches to them now, and we've done the first tests on already, but we have the launch event on Friday. And I should say, which I didn't mention before, the other one was a 6 month, so Viking VR, this was a 6-month installation, and it really had to be rugged and robust. Having achieved that, what the museum then gave us license to do was be a bit more experimental and produce things which might break, might not work terribly well, really sort of push the limits a little bit, because this is actually quite basic. You know, you can download this, something similar to this on your mobile phone and get a Google Cardboard. It's not really very experimental. This technology has been around for quite a long time, but in a 6-month exhibition, it can't break down every day. You know, it has to work, and so we needed to use technology that was tried and tested and relatively robust. And also, it was a bit more innovative this time last year than it would be now, but it's really not now. Most people have experienced, as you've all demonstrated, this kind of thing now. So we wanted to try things which hadn't been tried before, things which might not work quite so well, but which helped us to think through the technology and how far we could push the technology in certain directions, how we could use the technology in new ways which may or may not work. I mean, that's the nature of experimentation, so we decided to be a bit more experimental. So we've done this as an events-based thing, so with a site-specific, event-based installations. So again, using quite artistic terminology, it's sort of the language of the digital media art, really, rather than conventional archaeological interpretation. So the first of these was called Whispering Graffiti, and these are both kind of like, they started off as kind of beta testing names, but I think they've sort of more or less stuck now because we didn't redecide the name. They're just sort of, that's what they're called now. There's no going back. It's like it's on film, so. And I think so the first one is Whispering Graffiti, and what would happen in this is you'd walk into a specific prison cell with a very low light level. I think there might be a slide actually where I've attempted to explain this. Please note, interesting graffiti. That's the main point of this slide. So you'd walk into a prison cell and the light would be quite low, and you'll have a torch which is attached to one of these handsets, which is actually a handset from HTC Vive VR system, but you wouldn't use the mask. We've hidden the mask away. So you have a handset and a torch, and you walk around the prison cell looking for graffiti. And the reason we've used a VR system at all for this is because these kind of VR systems, these more sort of expensive, fully immersive VR systems, they allow you to do the virtual reality, but they also allow you to track a handset really carefully. So you walk around the space and you have a torch, and the torch, you're actually looking for the graffiti. So you're actually walking around a prison cell looking for these kinds of carvings. And then as you get closer and you sort of shine the light on them, and you know you can use a torch to try and read difficult to read carvings and things like that. As you get closer, the graffiti starts to speak to you. So you've got speakers embedded in the walls. And you hear the voice of a prisoner, or depending on the track we're using, you hear the voice of a curator interpreting what this carving might mean, why it might have been made, and what that person might have been trying to communicate by that carving. So pictures of ships, pictures of women, it was a men's prison, and carvings of names, carvings of, in this case, really brilliant one, hunting scenes. So obviously sort of memories of different places at different times. And so this isn't visually immersive at all. So it's an immersive experience for sure, but a large part of the immersion comes from the fact you're in a room, so you can walk around the room, you can get really close to the graffiti, you can touch the brickwork, you can feel that space. So it's an uninterrupted physical experience. The only augmentation is the sound, which is delivered through the sense of play, of exploration. So as I said, it's play without the silliness. It's not sort of a trivial play, it's just this idea that you're looking for the graffiti. And it's a way we felt of really communing with the people who'd been in that space before you and really bringing their voices where they found a way to express themselves to the fore. And the graffiti might seem trivial, but it is a really meaningful expression of, if you're in here for weeks and you carve something as relatively elaborate as this, I mean, it's a real voice in this space. It's a real voice that we don't necessarily hear. And it's a voice people are really interested in. And when you walk around the prison now, people notice this stuff and they get really excited about it. It's one of the things that people really latch onto, I think, just because it does show a little bit of humanness in what can be quite a dehumanizing space. So you walk around and these things fade in and out as you move around the space and discover these different bits of graffiti. So this is the first one. The second one is a bit more technologically complex, and it's called something like A Hidden World, although we've yet to decide on its actual title, but I think, yeah, probably is this. And I like this slide because I assembled this because this is actually all of the individual stories that we're telling in, or representative of the stories we're telling in this project. But it actually just looks like a really nice holiday in Yorkshire, which I quite like. So it's A Hidden World was all about trying to, again, get at the lives of people who'd been imprisoned in one of these cells. And in this case, what you have is, and I'll revisit this slide, I'll flip backwards and forwards again. You have an iPad, which is the line in the middle of that diagram, and you hold it up. So this is some real old school augmented reality in some ways, but it's using one of the newer iPads. So it's got quite a lot of processing power, and what it's doing is it's actually mapping the room in front of you and figuring out where you're looking in the room just from the geometry of the room. And then when you hold it up, and there's like a doorway like this, it recognizes the doorway and then it slowly fades in alternative views out of the door. So rather than seeing a bolted prison cell door, you see a view out of the doorway of a pub up on Swaledale. And then when you look around you, you'll see other things from the pub. So maybe there's a table, well, there is a table, I don't say maybe it exists, a table with some pewter mugs and cutlery and things happening there, and just little fragmentary memories from previous lives, previous experiences of people we know are in these prison cells. And so it's real storytelling in the sense that we don't actually know that that person ever experienced that exact scene. The purpose of this is to really emphasize the fact that these people had normal lives. They weren't just victims, they were people who'd lived normal lives, sometimes criminal lives, but also sometimes not terribly criminal lives in Yorkshire during this period. And the stories we've chosen to tell are that. So this one is of a pub up on Swaledale. We've got Luddites were imprisoned here, so people who smashed weaving machinery because they were weavers. Various complicated politics that can be talked about there, but what we really want to emphasise is the human dimension. And so we have scenes from a tenter's yard where the fabric that they produced would have been stretched and prepared, and you can walk around in amongst these stretched canvases and they turn the space into a very different maze-like space. And then a ship, so one of the most sort of dramatically immersive ones is that you'll hold the iPad up and a wall will disappear and you'll have a view over the side of a sailing ship across the open ocean, and you just see the ship rocking and listing, and so you'll be in a prison cell, but one entire wall of the prison cell will be a view across the ocean. And this was inspired by the ship graffiti that we saw elsewhere, but also by our knowledge that a large number of sailors were imprisoned in the jail. So it's about taking this 18th century prison and using it to create links out into an 18th century world, really, an 18th century landscape. And we don't answer too many questions about this, so we don't really say why you're looking at what you're looking at. We leave it up to the viewer to decide, in a sense, who they are in this scene and what they're looking at. The depictions are depictions of 18th century life, but we don't make too many explicit statements about this. And the reason for that is partly a production decision, a creative decision, that we want to leave that ambiguity there because we don't want to be too didactic. We don't want to be telling people too much how they should feel about these people, how they should feel about these experiences. But also from a research point of view, we're really interested in how people will react to being put in that position where there's that sort of slight ontological uncertainty where you're thinking, is this simulated time travel? Am I having a memory? Is it just me like being in a cinema? How do you reconcile that? And we're going to talk to people about that and how they reconcile those ideas in mind as a sort of creative exercise so that next time we can develop those ideas further. So that's those ideas. I won't go too deeply into those stories, but something worth mentioning, haven't mentioned it yet, is that the way this will be triggered is by picking up one of these objects. So this is a handmade weaving shuttle. I don't know if anyone in here has ever done any weaving before, but this would be wound up with thread, and then when you're weaving you'd throw it across to create is that the warp or the weft, I don't know, but the thread goes across and then you do all the rest of it. So, and this is a really nice object. You can see it's really smooth, it's been really handled, so it's an antique, but people will pick these objects up and they'll take them into the room, because if you like that object, you'll pick it up outside and take it into the room, and then you'll put it down on a table, and then you'll pick up the iPad, and that's the thing that will trigger this experience. It'll trigger what experience you have in that room. So depending on what you're interested in, which object interests you most, you'll be able to trigger a different kind of experience. And it could be, so we've got the pub scene being triggered by this mug, and then also my favourite one is this big shell, because we're reading about sailors during this time. Just a tiny little bit of anecdotal research, well, it came out of our research, but a little anecdotal detail, which was that these kinds of shells were often owned by sailors because obviously they almost uniquely had access to tropical beaches. So a shell would have been a really prized item. And all of these are objects deliberately which connect to an aspect of life which is productive, playful, or enjoyable. And so rather than, handcuffs or the kinds of crockery, plates you'd be given in jail, we wanted to emphasize things from outside of the prison. And it creates quite a nice juxtaposition that these objects, which could be up in the jolly, what was life like in 18th century York part of the museum, are taken down into the prison, and that juxtaposition between a relatively normal life that we'd all recognise and perhaps enjoy, but also this part of life that we certainly wouldn't enjoy, is made. And it's made in a way which, again, isn't didactic, but allows people to make those contrasts and just think, wow, these were normal people, make of that what you will. And then they can go off into the rest of the museum. They can go off upstairs to 18th century York, to the reconstructed street, the Victorian street, and they can really think about how the lives of people who were imprisoned downstairs connected to the stories that are being told upstairs, and vice versa. So trying to remove this idea that the prison was a completely isolated institution separated from the rest of society, and really emphasising the fact this is an integral part of 18th century society, and if you put a step wrong, there was every chance that you would end up at least at some point in your life in a prison. I mean, most people didn't, but plenty of people did. So so that summarises this, and this was a nice moment where we really realised how I must admit this is staged. I saw him doing it, then ran across the room and made him do it again while I took a photo. But it really emphasises how the tactility of the objects can be immersive. So at the beginning we had the Viking tent, which was an absolute theatrical confection designed to create this sense of immersion. But then when Theodore here picked up the shell and started listening to it and saying, oh, I can hear the sea, that's really nice. It's a really huge shell, so it's really good for that. It suddenly occurred to us that this tactility and this physical experience of handling the objects and moving around the space was as important to the immersive experience as the digital. So again, it was this kind of finely balanced sense that, yes, this is a digital immersive experience of the kind that we're excited by and all pursuing research in at the moment, but it takes place within what is already a very immersive experience, and we can introduce physical objects to manipulate that as well and to control how that immersion unfolds and how people react to it, and just give people space to play and have fun. So, conclusions then. 3 conclusions really, which are sort of sequential in the sense that We now believe very firmly, and this part of the project is over, the design phase of the project is over, of both projects, that the skills present within museums have the potential to play an integral role in the production of new media forms using immersive technology. And the reason this is an interesting conclusion is that a lot of the production skills to produce high quality immersive experiences are thought to be missing from the British creative economy, or not present enough. There aren't enough of them. But we argue that in the museum sector, and we'd like to test this more broadly in the heritage sector, that many of the skills do exist, the deep skills. They may not have been applied to the production of immersive media, but the project that we've just run has allowed, this is your expression, Nicole, but the expression of curatorial skill through technology, through specific kinds of technology, and the ability to make that happen. The trick to making that happen is just working together in dialogue and having people with technological know-how really working on an everyday basis with people who know how to design immersive experiences, i.e. exhibition designers and curators. Subtly different conclusion to that is that we believe that this convergence, which is this is the realization of what I was trying to explain at the beginning, this convergence can lead to authentically new media forms. So rather than trying to replicate a horror film within a virtual reality medium, rather than trying to make Mario Kart in an immersive virtual reality experience, this is about the production of completely new forms of interactive media. And I'm not going to blow our trumpet that much. There's nothing here which is actually going to, absolutely going to have blown your minds. But it's just that subtle evolution of concepts and ideas that curators have been talking to for a long time about how can we connect narrative to object to space, and how can these things be configured in different ways. And with the insertion of interactive media, immersive media into that equation, you get a whole new range of possibilities. And so we've just been able to reconfigure things and come up with something which is a bit new, a bit more interesting. And it's the first tiny little step towards producing these things. 1%. We've got years and years and years and years and years, as a society to do this. Yeah, but it's just, I think, we're just making those first steps now across the entire creative sector. But I think we've demonstrated that museums should play a role in this. And if, as the government constantly tell us that they're hoping for, the British creative sector is going to be the leading creative sector in the world, museums should play an important role in that. And then finally, we also have demonstrated that museums can be go-to venues for media. And I think this is possibly the most exciting one in some ways for me, which is that people don't necessarily just go to a museum to go and see traditional museums experiences. They're open to new kinds of experiences and different kinds of experiences, provided that those experiences work and don't completely upset what you've gone there to do. So if you've gone there to spend a day with your family, you don't want to be told that you have to sit for 2 hours playing this virtual reality game, for example. I think people are open to it, provided that we design experiences appropriate for the kind of experience that people want to have in that space. And the final conclusion then is, I think that now we've got to this point, we're really going to consolidate this and try to make these principles reusable for other similar organisations, similar collaborations, and also try to test it in other settings. So we've been very museum specific so far. We've worked in a couple of different kinds of museums, but only in England up till now, and also not in other kinds of heritage settings. So we'd be very interested, for example, in outdoor museums or even just outdoor heritage sites. So how would you develop technologies which work in a formal garden? How would you develop technologies which work on a battlefield? All of these different things, they have different requirements and different opportunities for developing media in new directions. So I'll leave it there, I think.
Time for a couple of quick questions, if anyone's got one. Yes.
Really interesting, very fascinating for us what we're doing in Motive, but I don't want to keep
Oh, yeah,
that. I had just reviewed an article about your last book, Evaluation and Digital Storytelling in the Wild, about open-air heritage sites by Adriana Newcastle and Jenny Keith at Cardiff. The reviewer one of the reviewers made the special editor of the issue, and they made a very interesting comment about how this is really important, and also for us to do work that touches on the not so conclusive, the not so complete, embrace it and include it. They made the comment that funding bodies like HRC and others need to also allow for evaluation that's not obsessed with the quantitative and always proving that way that things like that work.
Yeah.
But we're not quite there yet, so I was wondering if your experience of this, if you would also agree that it's important also to do more qualitative, more open-ended, admit the tensions, the not very complete answers, and also have when we record impact of these things.
So I think...
so what's the way
No. Nicole will have an answer to this question, but I'll just say one thing very briefly, which is that for me, personally, I've probably started this off as an archaeologist working with digital media, and I've been drawn far more towards the digital media arts and this idea of the idea in the arts of response and how people respond, and the fact that we need to own our authorial voice and actually just sort of produce media as people produce media elsewhere, and then see how people respond. And I think you're right, it's that sort of sense. If you're an artist and you produce an installation, you don't necessarily think this is how you have to respond. You know, this is what I want from you. You just go to the space and think, how are people reacting? You know, how do they feel about it? And anything is fine. And I think that's the thing. We don't need to nail it down as much as perhaps we've, as digital people, felt we have to. I don't think that people who design exhibitions necessarily feel quite the same way, but I don't know. So, Nicole, do you want to?
We had quite an interesting experience when we first started the project, because the relationship with York Museums Trust was a very slow building thing, and one of the things that we had to deal with was different interpretations of risk. And that comes back exactly to that idea of they were doing a massive project with the British Museum, and they needed to know that what we were producing was robust, and you know, that it passed all their health and safety, so we had to buy really, really expensive paint so that it was okay for people to breathe on the mask and things. And they were kind of much more interested in that and the numbers that we were going to get out of it. And we were much more interested in the kind of personal experiences. But actually we found that we were saying the same thing. But it took us quite a long time to get a kind of common vocabulary together. And actually Viking VR ended up as a kind of boundary object for those conversations. And we had a lot of conversations about the authenticity and the idea of kind of how could you do qualitative evaluation around something that's quite a practical experience, but it's the kind of the emotive stuff, the emotive personal experiences that we were really interested in. And then reporting back to the HRC on that was difficult.
We're still doing it, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. So we just applied for follow-on funding and putting in the kind of facts and figures in that application. It was quite an interesting experience for us to kind of say, you know, an 87-year-old guy teaching a 9-year-old how to use VR. That's the kind of narrative that we were getting from Viking VR. Instead, we were putting in 100,000 people. You know, 70% of people used VR for the first time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it's definitely something that
we need to get better at.
Being able to kind of have these risky projects that, you know, maybe don't have the numbers at the end, but do have the kind of really personal, individual experiences.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that was really, really fascinating. And
Thanks.
I used to live in York at one point, and I remember going to the Castle Museum and down to those cells in the basement section, when they had what at the time I saw as quite an, you know, this is probably about 6-7 years ago, what I thought were quite immersive setups then, where they had projections, I think it was, in each cell, and then of kind of slightly ghostly apparitions and voices telling you about their experience in the cell. And this now gives me a whole other level of the kind of immersion that one can have. I think you probably touched on it a bit, but I wondered, is that what they were moving from? Was that the most recent installation they had? And then kind of, I can't remember exactly what that was like. What was sort of lacking, do you think, in that kind of installation that you wanted to add to?
I'll say something, which is just, I think, so these projections which are in the cells now, I think they're... They are still there. Yeah. So it was a great attempt at that, and I quite like it as well because it uses fairly basic technology rather than, even for then, it didn't throw every technological possibility at it. So in that way, I think it's great. But I think the kinds of interpretation that we've tried to achieve are slightly different. I don't know if you want what your...
We did a lot of observation of the existing exhibitions in there. So the way it is at the moment is you go into very dark cells, and each cell is very darkly lit. And then an actor is projected onto a wall and they talk to you. And it's quite dramatic, so you kind of go in and they'll be like, you know, all right, chum, I'm in a cell because I've done something bad. And it's because they're trying to tell you something very quickly. They have very, very complicated stories, and we did a lot of observation and found that younger visitors particularly didn't have a clue what was going on because it was such complicated, that there's no context because it's just one actor in a very, very dark cell. And actually quite overwhelming, so you go in and it's very loud, and someone shouts at you in a costume, and it's quite a kind of...
Sort of dramatises it, it's like high drama, isn't it? And I think it was sort of, we struggled with that a little bit because 90% of people who visit that space, especially people from York, if they have a connection to that space, you know, it's going to be at that level and not at the level which is celebrated and serious, which is the kind of like the Roundtree story and all of these stories of rich and powerful. And I think it could, not on its own, but as part of a bigger thing, trivialise some of those working class stories a little bit, because it sort of creates a sense of drama and fun, where actually I think there's an opportunity to tell a bit more of a reflective story about the kinds of lives that these people had, who ultimately are the ancestors of most of us have ancestors who were weavers and publicans and coal miners, rather than ancestors who were owned confectionery companies and were multi-millionaires. So it's, I think that's...
Yeah, and we also wanted to bring objects into it. So we wanted to bring some of the artefacts from the collections in, which is quite difficult in that space because we don't have any display cabinets or anything. So
no, true. Yeah, but thanks. Yeah.
Very out of time. Let's just thank Gareth for a little bit.